Yeah, I'm really excited to have the three of you on here. You're all coming from different contexts, doing ministry in a similar, I mean, you're all connected in a way to congregations, but you're also all each doing sort of different things and doing other pieces of ministry outside of that as well. So I'm really excited to hear the different perspectives, your experiences, and to see what kind of conversation we have. We're going to start off with sort of a background question kind of thing. So I want to ask each of you what it has looked like to bear witness against queerphobia as a person of faith. And so, what have your experiences been? What, your perspectives of what sorts of actions maybe have you been involved in or have you seen happen around you? And, what learnings have you taken from those, that type of thing. So I'm going to post that in the chat there just so that you have it as a reference. And the question is, what has bearing witness against queerphobia as a person of faith looked like for you? And I guess whoever feels called to start can start.
Well, I can go. I think I talked about this morning, so it's fresh on my mind a little bit. But I think I go back to my own personal experience. I was raised in a Pentecostal church, and early messaging in my life that one-way ticket to eternal damnation for who I was. And so as I started to go through puberty and became more aware of my not only sexual identity but gender identity as well, I realized that the church wasn't a place for me. And before probably I ended up being subjected to conversion therapy or any of the institutional stuff, I left. I sort of bowed out and looked to find spirituality wherever I could. But there were many deep wounds of that time for me, that sort of propelled me into doing this work now. And I'll tell you, I'll never would have thought I'd be in a church again. I left in my teens, and I was a young queerdo, just exploring my sexuality. A friend of mine who we had sort of been exploring our sexuality together told me one day that he thought all gays should be shot. And I was like, what? I don't know where I heard this, but he took that to heart, and one day he shot himself. And it was a very formative experience because I remember being at his funeral, and his mother was hysterical, crying, asking the minister, is my son in hell? And the minister wouldn't say one way or another, but he said we could pray for his soul. And my 14-year-old self instantly was like, how dare you? Who are you to be speaking on behalf of God? And who are you to be saying that somebody who was so hurt by society is going to be tortured for the rest of their life? That is not love. And instinctually, I knew God was love, and this person didn't know God. Not in the way that I did, anyhow. So it sort of launched me on the beginning of this journey to have an authentic relationship with God so that I could, in a way, like, interpret. I didn't have language or words for it then. Of course, I was just an angry 14-year-old. And so one of the things that came up this morning, which was interesting, as we were talking about the landscape in Alberta, 10 years ago when the church became Affirming, we're sitting in worship planning meeting, and they're saying, oh, it was a really kind of tense time. Somebody had put up a pride flag in Calgary at the church, and somebody threw a brick through the church window. And I'm like sitting there like, oh my God. Because I remembered shortly after my friend died, I was angry. I was downtown. I found a brick lying on the sidewalk, and I picked it up and I hucked it through a church window. And I confessed that to the whole congregation this morning. I don't think it was the same story because the timeline doesn't really line up. So, but for the book, we could say it was the same church. I don't know, but it was just interesting to hear that, and to think, I wonder, how many of these acts against the churches could have been done by somebody who was hurt by the church too, right? And so fast forward all these years, here I am, never thinking to be in a church again and speaking from the chancel, speaking from the pulpit, supporting people who are continuing to be hurt from churches, who come to me from other faith communities, who are being subjected to conversion therapy, who are being kicked out of the house, who are being told that who they are is not valued or true, or that there's something wrong with them. You know, that the stuff that we dealt with in my youth is still a thing. Like, I feel like we've come a long way, but there's still a lot to be taught and learned. And I think for as vocal and as loud as bad religion is, we need to be as vocal and as loud in offering good interpretations of scripture that really do resonate with the truth of the gospel, that is the good news, and that love is for everyone, and it doesn't stop at any intersectional boundary or distinction of who you are. It's there for you. And so that is an important piece, but also I think the piece of, you know, I think of the teachings of Christ, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling, I'm just going to blah, 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 we've got some time. But, you know, I often think, how do I reconcile Christ on the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do, when I think of people who do cause harm in the community? At the same time with Christ flipping the tables and chasing people out with a whip, right? So it's like, I think of it, you know, as raising kids. It's like you would never shame a child for not knowing where they're at, for seeing the world the way they see the world. Yet at the same time, as parents, the obligation is to hold children accountable to do better until they know better. And so that's what the piece of, and the tension of our times, like, how do we navigate protecting people who are vulnerable, made vulnerable, and who are targeted from people who have maybe a worldview that is more tribal, is more ethnocentric, that can't quite see outside of who looks like them or smells like them or thinks like them. How do we protect those people, at the same time nurture development and growth for people to see things deeper, more beautifully and expansively, as, you know, Christ's gospel and ministry was all about. So that's the tension of our times. I don't know how to do it. Maybe we can come up with some ideas today, but I'll just throw that out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you. Jenn, or would you like to go next?
Yeah, just picking up on Keith sharing some of his personal experience. What resonated for me was a different experience coming into the church. So I never grew up in the church, but I still grew up. You all right?
Sorry, there was a noise. It's okay. Sorry.
So I never grew up in the church, but I still grew up with a whole lot of internalized homophobia, right? And it was the internalized homophobia that kept me sick for a long time, not coming out and not able to talk about it within my, you know, family of origin, and all those complicating issues, right? And then that, you know, leading me down a whole other path of, you know, drug and alcohol abuse, you know, not having the Gay and Straight Alliance in schools at that time. I mean, so we're definitely making some improvements. But, you know, when I sit back and I ask myself, okay, where did that internalized homophobia come from? You know, I think the church has a lot to do with that, right? And that that ideology that of heteronormativity, and so, you know, yeah, like what Keith is saying, you know, how do we reconcile that, and how do we realize that? And then when I did actually find my way back to the church, I actually had a really positive experience. It was when I started coming back to the church in my 30s, or I was about 30. I found a really warm, welcoming, wouldn't necessarily say affirming community, but I did find, I mean, they would make, you know, there was homophobic comments, I guess, that would be said in that, but overall it was an experience where I was allowed to be who I was allowed to talk about who I was, and then I was allowed to interpret this, or this sense of feeling loved, feeling welcomed, feeling okay. That was actually one of the first times I ever remember feeling okay. So even though people got things wrong, I was still feeling welcomed and loved. And because of that, I actually started, like, I became open to hearing the gospel. I became open to hearing messages of what Jesus would talk about. And it was in that place that I actually started to like myself. I started to actually feel that God loved me for exactly who I was. And I actually got that from being inside the church and not from being in society, which is not, which I know is not the norm. You know, most people, I think, if you would ask, who identify the LGBTQ spectrum, would say that they've not had a positive experience in church. But because we were able to make room for one another, we did find a path that worked. We did find a common dialogue and a common way to communicate, even though, you know, they were getting things, they would sometimes get things wrong. And I was very much in discernment about who I was. And I had the room to be in that discernment, and not, you know, because I, most of the times I get people that say, oh, you are transgender, you're trans, like I sort of, I guess I appear that way to other people. They assume I'm transgender, but although I really like, I like that I have androgynous qualities, you know, sexuality, you know, I'm attracted to women, so I'm a woman who's attracted to women, so I'm a lesbian. But that's another, that brings up another thing, is that I'm not convinced that our society is well educated in the difference between sex, gender, and sexuality. People are conflating all of these issues, right? Or these topics. So it's only been recent years that people have been starting to understand that when we talk about gender, we're not talking about genitals. So this, how can we parse these topics out so that they're more clearer for people? Because you got to remember, everybody, like when I look out of the congregation on Sunday morning, you know, 80% of that congregation is still looking at the world through a heteronormative lens. And so I think the education piece, I guess, is really important, and allowing and having those brave spaces where we are allowed to make mistakes, we're allowed to not get it right and not be shamed for it, but have the humility enough to be learning from it. So I don't know if I answered any question in that, but for what it's worth.
Yeah, no, thank you. Jenn, I'm wondering, did you want to say a bit about your experience of what happened to Emmanuel?
Oh, the hate crime?
Yeah.
Well, so actually it was Parkminster United Church that was hit first, which is actually a stone's throw from my house. And the Romans 8, forget it, Romans 8:24, 36, I can't remember. Anyway, it came there first, the church shall remain holy. And for them, they spray painted on the sidewalk in front of the door as you were going into the church. It was on the concrete. And the community immediately threw up resistance, that this is not who we are. This is not okay. And even the local news media got on board and wanted to interview everybody and understand how we were going to integrate this act. And so before we even had a chance to really like it, that was just starting to happen. And then Emmanuel got hit, which is in the downtown core of